There's a habit you have, and it's quietly destroying the way people see you. Not loudly, not dramatically, but slowly, consistently, every single day. And the worst part? You think it's helping you. You think you're being clear. You think you're being smart. You think you're making people understand you better. But in reality, you're making them lose interest in you. Look closely at your own conversations. Every time you say something, you don't stop there, do you? You add more. You explain again. You rephrase the same point. You add unnecessary details just to make sure they get it. And if there's even a second of silence, you rush to fill it. Why? Because that silence makes you uncomfortable. It feels like they didn't understand you. It feels like you're being judged. It feels like you're losing control of the moment. So you panic, quietly, and you start talking again. More words, more explanations, more effort. But here's what's actually happening on the other side. They've already understood you. They got your point 10 seconds ago. But you kept going. And now, instead of sounding clear, you sound unsure. Instead of sounding confident, you sound like you're trying too hard. And people can feel that. They may not say it to your face, but their attention starts fading. Their mind starts drifting. Because when someone talks too much, it doesn't feel like confidence. It feels like they're seeking approval. And approval is never respected. Think about the last time you met someone who talked nonstop. At first, you listened. Then slowly, you stopped caring. Not because they were boring, but because they didn't know when to stop. Now here's the uncomfortable truth. That person might be you. Every extra sentence you add, every unnecessary explanation, every time you refuse to let a moment stay silent, you're not increasing your value. You're diluting it. In a world where everyone is already desperate to be heard, the person who talks the most doesn't stand out. Before we continue, consider subscribing. It's completely free and takes just a few seconds for you. But it takes me hours of effort to create content like this. They disappear that you've been trained to believe something that sounds right, but quietly works against you. From school to social situations to everything you see online, you hear the same advice repeated again and again. Speak up. Express yourself. Communicate more. Make your point clear. And on the surface, it makes sense because no one wants to be ignored and no one wants to feel invisible. So you adapt. You start thinking that the more you say, the more powerful you become. The more you explain, the more intelligent you appear. The more you talk, the more control you have in a conversation. But reality doesn't work like that. In fact, it works in the exact opposite way. The more you talk, the less people value what you say. And you don't notice it happening because it doesn't happen instantly. It happens slowly, subtly, over time. At first people listen, then they start listening less carefully, then they start interrupting you, and eventually they stop asking for your opinion altogether. One day you realize something has changed. You're still talking the same amount, but people don't react the same way anymore. Your words don't land like they used to. They don't carry weight. They don't create impact. And you don't understand why. Because in your mind you're doing everything right. You're explaining clearly, giving more information, making sure there's no confusion. But that's exactly the problem. You're removing all the effort from the listener. You're giving them everything instantly with no space to think. And when people don't have to think, they don't stay engaged. Think about it like this. When something is always available, you stop valuing it. When something is rare, you pay attention to it. This applies to everything: time, attention, opportunities, and most importantly, words. When you speak constantly, your words lose their scarcity. And when there's no scarcity, there's no value. That's why the person who talks all the time gets ignored. Not because they're not smart or don't have good ideas, but because their words are too easy to access, too predictable, too constant, too available. There's no tension, and without tension there's no attention. Now think about the opposite. Think about someone who doesn't speak much. They're not trying to dominate the conversation or rushing to fill every silence. They just observe. They listen. And when they finally say something, it's short, clear, and then they stop. No extra explanation, no unnecessary words, just enough. And suddenly, everyone pays attention. Not because they said something magical, but because they didn't say everything. They left space. And that space forces people to lean in. It creates curiosity. It makes people think, what do they mean? Why did they say it like that? There's more behind this. That's influence. Not through force, not through volume, but through control. The control to not say everything. The control to not rush. the control to let silence do part of the work. But most people never develop this because silence feels uncomfortable. It feels like you're losing the moment. It feels like you're giving up control. So they overcompensate. They talk more, explain more, try harder, and without realizing it, they lower their own presence. Because when you're always talking, you're reacting. You're chasing the conversation. You're trying to keep it alive. But the moment you stop chasing, the dynamic shifts. Now people come to you. Now people wait for you to speak. Now your words have timing, not just content. And timing is everything. A perfectly timed sentence is more powerful than a long explanation. A short statement delivered with calm is stronger than 10 rushed sentences. But you miss that power every time you choose quantity over control, every time you add just one more point, every time you feel the need to explain again, every time you refuse to let a sentence end. You think you're strengthening your message, but you're weakening its impact. Because powerful communication is not about saying more. It's about knowing exactly when to stop. And most people never learn where that point is. So they keep talking and talking and talking until their words mean nothing. Most people think influence comes from what you say, the right words, the right tone, the right explanation. But real influence doesn't start when you speak. It starts the moment you stop. Because the human mind doesn't react to noise, it reacts to gaps, to pauses, to unfinished patterns, to things that feel incomplete. And silence creates that feeling instantly. Look at how your own mind works. When someone keeps talking nonstop, your brain switches off. Not consciously. You don't decide to ignore them. It just happens. Your focus drifts, your attention weakens, and you start thinking about something else because there's nothing left for your brain to do. Everything is being handed to you. There's no effort required, no curiosity, no tension, no reason to stay fully present. Now flip it. Someone says something and then they stop. They don't explain it. They don't rush to fill the silence. They just leave it there. And suddenly your mind wakes up. You start wondering what they meant, why they stopped, whether there's something more behind it. That's not random. That's psychological tension. And tension is one of the strongest forces that controls human attention. The brain hates unfinished things. It wants closure, completion, resolution. So when you remove constant talking and introduce silence, you create a gap, and that gap pulls people in. They lean closer, focus harder, and start engaging without you forcing them to. That's influence in its purest form, not pushing your message, but pulling their attention. But here's where it gets uncomfortable. Most people never experience this power because they destroy it too quickly. The moment silence appears, they panic. They feel exposed, awkward, like something is wrong. So they rush to fix it. They start talking again, adding more words, explaining things that never needed explanation. And instantly the tension disappears, the curiosity dies, and the moment loses its impact. All because they couldn't sit in silence for a few seconds. Understand this clearly. Silence is not empty. It is active. It is doing something inside the other person's mind. It is creating pressure, focus, and importance around what you just said. But you interrupt that process every time you speak too soon. It's like asking a question and answering it yourself before the other person can think. You remove their involvement. And when people are not involved, they are not influenced. This is why short, controlled speakers feel powerful. Not because they know more, but because they allow space for their words to land. They don't rush the moment. They let it breathe. They trust the silence, and that trust changes how people perceive them. Their presence feels calm, controlled, unbothered. While everyone else is trying to fill space, they are comfortable leaving it empty. And that contrast is what makes them stand out. Think about your own behavior. How many times have you ruined your own impact just because you couldn't stop talking? You said something meaningful, something that could have landed, but instead of stopping, you kept going. You added more explanation and diluted your own message until the original point lost its strength. Not because it was weak, but because you didn't give it space. This is the mistake most people never fix. They focus on improving what they say instead of controlling when they stop. But timing is everything. A sentence delivered at the right moment and followed by silence will stay in someone's mind far longer than a perfect explanation that never ends. Because people don't remember everything you say. They remember what made them think, what made them feel something, what made them pause internally. And that only happens when you stop giving them everything, when you allow a gap, when you let silence do its job. So the next time you speak, Don't focus on saying more. Focus on saying enough, and then having the discipline to stop. Because in that moment of silence, when everything feels slightly uncomfortable, when you feel the urge to continue, when your mind tells you to add one more line, that's the exact moment where your influence begins. Let's stop pretending this is just a communication habit. You don't talk too much because you're expressive, and you don't over-explain because you care about clarity. That's just the excuse you've been telling yourself. The real reason is much simpler and much harder to accept. You talk too much because you don't trust how you're being perceived. Every extra sentence, every unnecessary explanation, every time you feel the need to make things clear, it's not communication. It's insecurity trying to hide itself. Look at your own behavior carefully. When you say something, why don't you just stop? Why do you feel the need to add more? Why do you repeat the same idea in different words? Why do you explain things no one even questioned? It's not because people asked you to. It's because you're afraid of what they might think if you don't. Afraid they'll misunderstand you, judge you, or fail to see you the way you want to be seen. So you try to control it. You try to manage every possible interpretation before it even happens, and you do that by talking more, explaining everything, removing every possible doubt, and making sure there's no space left for confusion. But the more you try to control how people see you, the more control you actually lose. Because perception doesn't come from how much you say. It comes from how you carry yourself when you're not saying anything. Think about someone who is truly confident. Do they rush to explain themselves? Do they panic when there's silence? Do they feel the need to justify every decision? No. They say what they need to say, and then they stop, even if they're misunderstood, even if someone disagrees, even if silence follows. Because they're not trying to control every outcome. They're comfortable being seen without overmanaging it. Now compare that to your own behavior. You say something and immediately start adjusting it. You add context, soften your words, explain your intention, and try to make sure no one takes it the wrong way. And without realizing it, you reveal something important. You reveal that you're not fully confident in what you said. Because confidence doesn't chase understanding, it allows it. Confidence doesn't over-explain. It trusts that what was said is enough. But when you don't have that trust, you compensate. You talk more, explain more, try harder, and ironically, that's what makes people trust you less. People don't just listen to your words. They read your behavior. They sense your energy. And when you over-explain, it sends a signal subconsciously. This person is unsure. This person needs validation. This person is trying too hard to be accepted. And once that signal is there, everything you say after that begins to lose weight. Now here's where it gets deeper. Your problem is not that you talk too much. Your problem is that you can't handle silence. Silence feels like exposure. It feels like standing there with nothing to hide behind. No words, no explanations, no control, just you and how people perceive you in that moment. And that discomfort makes you escape into noise. You keep the conversation moving so you don't have to sit in that feeling. But every time you do that, you train your mind to believe that silence is dangerous, that silence means you're losing, that silence means you need to fix something. When in reality, silence is where your strength is supposed to show. If you can sit in silence without rushing, panicking, or trying to fix the moment, you send a completely different signal. This person is calm. This person is in control. This person doesn't need to prove anything. And that signal is far more powerful than any explanation you could give. But avoiding silence forces you into a trap driven by the need for approval, the need to be understood, the need to not be judged. As long as that need controls you, you will keep talking not because you want to, but because you feel like you have to. You'll keep reacting to the discomfort of being misunderstood by adding more and more words, even though no amount of explaining can ever fully control how someone sees you. The shift begins when you finally realize that you don't need to control every perception, explain every detail, or fill every silence. You just need to become okay with not being fully understood every single time. Because the moment you accept that, you stop over-explaining, stop chasing perfect communication, stop talking out of fear, and for the first time, start speaking with control. There's a moment, small and almost invisible, where everything changes. Not in the outside world, but inside you. It's the moment you say something, and instead of continuing like you always do, you stop. No extra words, no backup explanation, no trying to make it clearer. You just stop. And for a second it feels wrong, unnatural, almost uncomfortable. Your mind immediately reacts. Say something else. Add more. They might not understand. This is getting awkward. That voice becomes loud because it's the same voice that has controlled your behavior for years. The voice that tells you silence is dangerous. The voice that pushes you to fill every gap. The voice that makes you believe talking more equals control. But this time, you don't listen to it. You stay still. And that's where the shift begins. Because while you're standing there in silence, something is happening on the other side. The other person is waiting. They're processing what you said. They're thinking. And without realizing it, they're giving your words more importance than they usually would. Why? Because you didn't rush past them. You didn't bury your message under 10 more sentences. You let it sit. You let it exist on its own. And that changes everything. Now your words don't feel casual. They feel intentional, chosen, meaningful. And people respond to that differently. They listen more carefully, take you more seriously, and become more aware of your presence. Not because you said something extraordinary, but because you didn't dilute it. This is the part most people never experience because they never allow that silence to happen. They interrupt it, escape it, sabotage their own impact just to avoid a few seconds of discomfort. But if you can push through that moment, you unlock something powerful: control. Not control over others, but control over yourself. The ability to choose when to speak and when not to. The ability to resist the urge to over-explain. The ability to stay calm when silence appears. And that kind of control is rare. Look around you. Most people are reactive. They speak immediately, respond instantly, fill space without thinking. There's no pause, no awareness, no control, just constant noise. So when someone like you suddenly becomes different, it stands out. Not in a loud way, but in a way people can feel. Your presence becomes heavier, stronger, more grounded because you're no longer chasing the conversation. You're not trying to dominate it or prove yourself in every moment. You're simply choosing your moments, and that choice creates power. The less you feel the need to speak, the more people start wanting to hear from you. It's subtle, but it happens. They start asking for your opinion, paying attention when you begin to talk, and stopping themselves from interrupting you. Because now your words are not constant, they're selective. And selective attention always carries more value. Think about it like this. If someone is always available, you stop noticing them. But if someone is not always speaking, not always reacting, not always inserting themselves into every moment, their presence becomes noticeable because it's controlled. And control is what people associate with confidence. Not loudness, not dominance, not constant talking, but control. The ability to say less and still hold attention. The ability to remain silent and still be felt in the room. That's power. And once you experience it even once, you can't unsee it. You start noticing how much people talk unnecessarily, how often they ruin their own impact by adding words long after their point was already made. And you realize you used to do the same thing. But now you don't need to, because you understand something they don't. Influence is not built by saying more. It's built by saying just enough and having the discipline to stop right there. That moment right before you would normally continue, right before you would add one more sentence, right before you would try to make it perfect, that's the moment that defines everything. Because if you can stop there, you don't just sound different. You become different, calmer, more controlled, more intentional. And in a world where everyone is trying to be heard, that difference is what finally makes people listen. Understanding this is easy. Actually doing it is where most people fail. Because in theory, talk less sounds simple. But the moment you're in a real conversation, everything changes. The habit kicks in. The urge returns. That pressure to keep talking, to explain more, to fill the silence. It doesn't disappear just because you watched a video. It shows up right when it matters. And if you're not aware of it, you'll fall back into the same pattern instantly. So don't start by trying to become quiet. That's not the goal. The goal is control, and control starts with awareness. You need to catch the exact moment where you normally lose it. That moment right after you finish a sentence, that tiny gap where your mind says, add more. That's where your old habit lives. That's the point where you usually keep going automatically, without thinking. So here's the first shift. Next time you're in a conversation, don't focus on what you're saying. Focus on what happens after you say it. Say your point, then notice the urge. Notice how quickly your mind tries to continue. Notice how uncomfortable the silence feels. That awareness alone changes everything because now you're no longer reacting blindly. Now you see the pattern, and once you see it, you can interrupt it. At first, it's going to feel unnatural. You'll say something and then stop, and inside your head it will feel like something is wrong. Like you forgot to finish your thought, like the other person is waiting for more, like the moment is incomplete. Good. That feeling is exactly where the change is happening. Most people run away from that feeling. They fix it immediately by talking again. But you're not going to do that anymore. You're going to stay there in that silence without escaping it, even if it feels awkward, uncomfortable, or like you're losing control. Because you're not losing control, you're building it. And remember, you don't need to suddenly become someone who barely speaks. That's not the goal. This is not about being quiet all the time. It's about removing what's unnecessary. Right now, most of what you say after your main point is not adding value. It's repetition, clarification, insecurity filling space. So start cutting the excess. Not everything, just the extra. You make a point and normally explain it again. Don't. Let it stand. Trust that it's enough. Someone asks you something, and normally you add extra details to make sure they understand. Don't. Answer and stop. Let them ask if they need more. Because if they truly didn't understand, they will ask. And if they don't ask, your first answer was already enough. The hardest part is silence in group situations. When multiple people are talking, there's constant pressure to jump in, stay relevant, and avoid being left out. So most people speak even when they don't need to. They add comments that don't matter, react to everything, and try to stay visible. But constant visibility kills impact. When you're always present, you stop being noticeable. So try something different. In your next group conversation, speak less than you normally would. Not zero, just less. Observe more. Listen more. And when you do speak, make it count. Say something clear, something intentional, and then stop. Don't follow it with unnecessary words or try to hold the spotlight. Let your words land and let the moment move on. At first, it will feel like you're disappearing, like you're less involved or losing presence. But the opposite is happening. You're becoming more selective, and selective presence is always stronger than constant noise. And yes, you're going to fail sometimes. You'll overtalk again and fall back into old patterns. That's normal. This habit was built over years of trying to be understood, accepted, and in control of how people see you. So don't aim for perfection. Focus on progress. Every time you catch yourself and stop early, that's a win. Every time you resist the urge to explain more, that's progress. Every time you allow silence to exist without rushing to fill it, you're slowly rewiring your behavior. Over time, that control becomes natural. You stop speaking out of habit and start speaking with intention. And intention is what turns simple words into real influence. At some point, this stops being something you try to do. It stops being a technique, a trick, or a communication skill you practice in conversations. It becomes something deeper. It becomes who you are. Because in the beginning, you have to remind yourself constantly, talk less. Don't over-explain. Stay silent. You have to catch your habits, fight the urge, consciously stop yourself from continuing, and it feels forced, like you're holding something back or going against your natural behavior. But over time, something shifts. You stop feeling that pressure to fill every silence. You stop feeling responsible for making sure everyone understands you perfectly. You stop chasing the need to be constantly heard. And without even realizing it, you become calmer internally. Your mind is no longer racing to respond to everything, searching for the next thing to say, or trying to manage how people see you in real time. It slows down. And when your mind slows down, your presence changes. You start speaking less not because you're trying to, but because you genuinely no longer feel the need to say more. The urgency disappears, the pressure fades, and in its place there's control. Now when you speak, it's deliberate, not rushed, reactive, or forced. You say what needs to be said, and then you're done. No extra layers, no unnecessary explanations, no trying to make it perfect, just clarity and silence. And strangely, that silence no longer feels uncomfortable. It feels natural because you're no longer using words to protect yourself. You're no longer talking to avoid judgment. You're okay with being seen without constantly adjusting yourself, and that changes how people experience you. They start noticing things they missed before, your calmness, your patience, your ability to not react instantly. You don't jump into every conversation, dominate every moment, or rush to prove your point. And because of that, when you do speak, it stands out. Not because it's louder, but because it's rare, intentional, and chosen. People respect that even if they don't consciously understand why. They feel it. Because in a world where almost everyone is trying to be heard, very few people are comfortable not speaking. Very few people can sit in silence without anxiety or let a moment pass without trying to control it. And when someone can do that, it creates a different kind of presence, a quiet presence, but a strong one. The kind that doesn't need attention, yet naturally attracts it. The irony is that when you stop trying so hard to be understood, people understand you more. When you stop forcing your voice into every moment, people start listening when you actually speak. When you stop chasing attention, attention begins coming to you. Not because you demanded it, but because you became different from the noise. And difference is what the human mind notices first. You don't need to say more to be powerful, explain everything to be respected, or fill silence to stay relevant. In fact, those are often the exact things that weaken you. Real strength is quieter than that. It's slower, more controlled, more intentional. It doesn't rush, panic, or try to prove itself in every moment. It simply exists with enough confidence to say less. Most people spend their lives trying to improve what they say instead of questioning why they feel the need to say so much. But once you see it, you can't unsee it. You begin noticing it everywhere, in conversations, arguments, and social situations. You see how people overtalk, over-explain, and try to control perception with endless words, and you realize that used to be you. But now you have a choice: to continue reacting or start controlling, to keep filling every silence or let it exist, to keep talking out of habit or start speaking with intention. And that choice, repeated over time, becomes your identity. Eventually, you no longer need to remind yourself to talk less because you've removed the need behind the behavior. And when that need disappears, what remains is presence. Calm, controlled, unshaken presence. And in a world full of noise, that kind of presence will always be heard without saying much at all.